Do you know what? I could play all day in my green cathedral. Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name, apparently it's that. If you are new here, if you've just stumbled across this video whilst wandering through the fields and meadows of YouTube, or you just fancied looking at somebody rattling on about an old Doctor Who story, why not press that subscribe button? It's that one there. You can like as well, you can leave a comment down below. Do all those things, you make me very, very happy. Now, I've been watching some classic Doctor Who, as many of you may know, part of my Doctor Who Revisited series where I'm looking at old classic Doctor Who serials, not reacting to them because there's plenty of that out there, but I'm just talking about them and reviewing them and discussing their strengths and their weaknesses and where they fit into the great canon of Doctor Who's 61-year history. Today we're looking at The Seeds of Doom from 1976. Hadn't planned to watch this, but it sort of came across my radar, and Seeds of Doom is a story I can always watch because for me it is the quintessential 1970s, mid-1970s Doctor Who yarn. It's a story that for me encapsulates everything great about the Tom Baker era of Doctor Who, because Tom, at this stage, at the end of his second season, was still in what we might refer to as his imperial phase, when he was still the new Doctor and he still had this sense of mystery about him, this sense that he really was an alien. I love the scenes throughout his early part of his era where he's sort of gazing off into space and he's thinking about unknowable things and he seems distant and alien and aloof and he's cold and callous and he's worlds away from his previous incarnation, the very avuncular Jon Pertwee. And this at the time was still a bit of a culture shock for fans like me who'd enjoyed the Pertwee era with its colourful action and adventure and wild monsters and that feeling of great adventure that came with the Pertwee era, that sort of Bondian feel to it. Baker is at this stage very much the alien, very much a character we don't know if we can trust him or if we like him or if we are comfortable in his presence. That was to change, of course, a few years down the line with a change of producer and script editor and with the interference of the dreaded Mary Whitehouse complaining that the show was too scary. Tom's performance became mellower, became more comedic, became a bit looser. But that's a whole different issue and a whole different era of Doctor Who. We're talking now about 1976 and the end of Tom's second season, season 13 of that classic Doctor Who. And The Seeds of Doom is, for me, one of the great Doctor Who stories. And whenever I think about my favourite Doctor Who serials from the original series, Seeds of Doom is somewhere near the top of my rankings, somewhere at the top, somewhere number 2. It's never lower than number 2, to be honest. I'm always torn between Jon Pertwee's superb, chilling, Quatermassian Inferno that ended his first season, season 7, and this, which is a great adventure story. And this is one of those stories that I would suggest to people who don't know a lot about Doctor Who. It doesn't have much of the TARDIS in it. It isn't about travelling through time and space. It's the classic, the Doctor on Earth combating some terrible alien threat. As was the trend in this particular season, the story riffs off classic science fiction and classic horror. Now, previously in the season, we'd had Philip Hinchcliffe and his script editor Robert Holmes upping the ante for the show, making it a bit more adult, taking it away from the rubber monsters of the Pertwee era and moving it more into horror. So we had stories that riffed on The Mummy, and we had stories that riffed on Forbidden Planet, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and here we have a story that riffs on The Thing from Another World. But it's laced with a slight feeling of those ITC series from the 1960s. I'm thinking of things like particularly The Avengers. This is riffed on a particular Avenger story, title of which I've forgotten, but I'll put it down here, which is about a sort of an alien plant type thing. It was one of the Avengers' rare forays into sort of proper science fiction things. Seeds of Doom is a 6-part story, and this is interesting because this is about the time when 6-part stories changed from what they had been in the Pertwee era. Whereas the 6-part Pertwee stories were big and sprawling and sometimes seemed a little bit padded with episodes that sagged in the middle, this particular era started the trend towards almost 2 stories bolted together, a 2-part story and then a 4-part story, and they sort of work together seamlessly to create one whole. We see this later on in Baker serials like Talons of Wen Chiang and The Invasion of Time. Cedar Dome, which incidentally is written by Robert Banks Stewart, who had written Terror of the Zygons earlier in the season, and he was responsible later on for shows like Bergerac and I think Shoestring. He had also written in the 60s for I think some of the adventure shows, so that's why it has that slightly ITC feel to it, I think. Starts off in the Antarctic at a remote research base where two members of the expedition team extract this strange gourd-like pod from the snow. They take it back to the lab. They realise that it's something rather unusual. And as the episode progresses, we see that the gourd comes alive, emits this tentacle-type thing, which attaches itself to one of the members of the expedition team, who starts to transform into something nasty, monstrous and plant-like. The Doctor, this is interesting because the Doctor at this point still has his connections to Earth and his connections to UNIT, and although UNIT appear in this story, Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart doesn't turn up. But it's interesting that even as far as the end of Baker's second season, they still hadn't quite let go of the UNIT connections. I mean, after this story, that's gone, not really referred to again for several years. But here the Doctor is back on Earth with Sarah Jane. He's called into the World Ecology Bureau to study photographs and reports of this strange thing that's been found in the Antarctic. And the Doctor is dispatched to the Antarctic to take a look at this thing. He arrives there with the redoubtable Sarah Jane Smith, Elizabeth Sladen, and they quickly discover that something really nasty has happened, that this man is well on his way to transforming into an alien creature, which the Doctor recognises as a Krynoid, an alien life form from a distant planet that has travelled to Earth, pods of two, to sink their roots into a planet and suck it dry and turn everything on the planet into Krynoid life forms. Doctor realises that it's a race against time to stop the thing germinating. The end of the second episode, the character who's been turned into a Krynoid, that part of the story is resolved, and I won't go into spoilers in case you've not seen it, even though it's nearly 50 years old. I won't spoil it for you. And the rest of the story takes place back in England. Now, in the first part, we're introduced to a character called Harrison Chase, played brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly, by the late great Tony Beckley. He's a botanist. He's obsessed by plants, and he's got this estate out in the country, and he spends his time growing plants, tending for plants. He's absolutely obsessed by plants. And when the existence of this pod in the Antarctic is drawn to his attention, he sends two of his thugs, Scorby and Keeler, played by John Challis, yes, Boise from Only Fools and Horses, and an actor called Mark Jones. They're sent off to the Antarctic to try and reclaim this pod. But back in England, the Doctor eventually realises that Harrison Chase has got hold of the second pod. He and Sarah Jane infiltrate Chase's estate, and all hell breaks loose across the next 4 episodes when the pod germinates, infects Keeler, and another Krynoid starts to grow. And on the estate, the Doctor and Sarah have to try and find a way to defeat this thing before it germinates. It's just a great story. It's quite a simple story. It's a simple story of a very hostile, malignant alien force that comes to Earth. The Doctor has to fight it. It's sort of very much what Doctor Who is about to some extent. But it's done with such style. It's directed by Douglas Camfield, who was one of the show's great directors in the 60s and 70s. And he had a way of directing action scenes and giving things a real pace and a real gusto to them. It's a story full of action, whether it's all the stuff going on in the Antarctic and all the stuff going on. There's lots of running around, there's a couple of fights. Tom Baker is his best here because he's really physical and he's really challenging. There's great scenes where he gets into fist fights. The Doctor doesn't do that very often, but he jumps through windows to try and save Sarah from being turned into a Krynoid. He's pushing people about. He gets pushed about himself. It's very aggressive, and it's quite an adult story because there's a lot of nasty stuff going on here. There's the scenes where Chase has this mulching machine in one of his warehouses that turns things into mulch that's fed into the garden, and the Doctor and Sarah end up in this thing at a couple of points. And the whole script has this richness to it and great characterisation. And much as I like and admire modern Doctor Who and it's good fun, watching this again you sort of think, I wish Doctor Who had the time now to tell stories this way, with character depth. All the characters, no matter how small they are, there's quite a big cast. They're also well developed, like minor characters like Emilia Ducar, who's the dotty artist who sold Harrison Chase a painting that she hasn't been paid for, and that sort of paves the way for the Doctor and Sarah to be able to get into his house. Chase himself, I mean, what a character, one of the great villains of Doctor Who, very much cast in the mould of a Bond baddie, and certainly one of the baddies who turned up in things like the Avengers and those ITC shows that I referenced. It's classy, it's just a classy production, and the script is so good, and it's very mature. It doesn't talk down to its young audience. It says to the audience, look, this is the story, go with it. This is challenging and exciting stuff. It really is a terrific story. It's really well done. The effects are pretty good on the whole. There's a very good model shot of the Arctic base. The Krynoid costume is terrific. The actually man-sized Krynoid costume, as many of you may know, is in fact an Axon costume from The Claws of Axos, a story from John Pertwee's second season. They were bright orange. It's now been painted and turned into a green vegetable thing. It's exactly the same costume. I don't think I realised that at the time, but I became aware of it a few years later. Later on, we get all the stuff that's going on around Harrison Chase's house, and the Krynoid eventually becomes this huge, towering monstrosity with these great strands and tentacles thrashing about the place. It's a very good model. It's a model of the house with this thing, and presumably it's inflated with pumps in the tendrils to make it all move. But it looks really well. It's filmed very well. It looks great. It's just a great story. I can't fault Seeds of Doom, and it's one that I can always go back to. Jeffrey Burton's music is very creepy and has a sort of ominous tone to it. He also did the music for Terror of the Zygons. Performances. I mean, I know I'm all over the place with this review, jumping all over the place, but there's so much good stuff to sort of snatch out of the air. Tom Baker at his peak. Elizabeth Sladen coming towards the end of her time as Sarah Jane, of course. Harrison Chase, though, played by Tony Betley. What a performance. I mean, full of quiet malevolence and obsession and madness. It's a superb performance. John Challis, as I said, Boy Chief from Only Fools and Horses, a thug, a hoodlum, an ex-mercenary, ruthless, thinks with his fists, but very much a man who looks after himself. He's a loner, a lone wolf, but he puts himself before anybody else. Everybody's great in this story. It is perfection in 1970s Doctor Who to me. And as I said, the TARDIS doesn't really appear. It does appear right at the end in a scene which is slightly odd, because in the first episode, the Doctor and Sarah travel to the Antarctic by helicopter. At the end of the story, they arrive there in the TARDIS, and there's this joke about, you didn't change the coordinate program, but they didn't actually go to the Antarctic in the TARDIS. But anyway, it's by the by. So you get the TARDIS right at the very end, presumably just so that, they can remind people this is Doctor Who. It is a great adventure story. It really is absolutely terrific. And it's 6 episodes and it flies by. So much in it, as I said. And it does make me wish that Doctor Who would sometimes now take the time, instead of rushing through these 50-minute adventures, just pause a little bit and open up and develop characters and side things. Because it's nice to have lots of scenes in this where the Doctor isn't there. Other characters are front and centre, and you get to know about them, and they drive the narrative rather than focus on the Doctor, which we tend to have these days. But that's by the by. Seeds of Doom is an absolutely fantastic story. I'm sure as Doctor Who fans you've seen it more than once. If you haven't seen it, it's available on DVD. I'm still waiting for the Blu-ray of season 13. I presume it's being kept till much later in the run because it's one of the great seasons. Also available on paperback, written by Philip Hinchcliffe. The book is actually a bit disappointing. It's a bit of a run through the story, which is a bit odd because it is recognised as one of the great Doctor Who stories, but Hinchcliffe's novelisation is a bit on the thin side and a bit disappointing. But The Seeds of Doom is classic Doctor Who in its rawest form. And if you've not seen it, rush and find a copy of it now. It's on BBC iPlayer. Fantastic. Doctor Who and Tom Baker at its finest gets me a 10 out of 10 because I absolutely adore this story. I hope you've enjoyed the video. As I said, like and subscribe, leave a comment down below. I'll see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.